We hear a lot about private equity these days, but it can feel like a far-off financial concept that doesn't matter if you're not in the business world. However, the reality is that this industry is reshaping many of the places we know. For instance, earlier this month, shareholders of the pharmacy chain Walgreens approved a $10 billion acquisition by private equity firm Sycamore. This will turn the brand into a private entity and is likely to bring several changes to its operations and strategy in the coming months. From big-name companies to the ownership of major hospital systems and media outlets, private equity firms are slowly buying up greater control of critical sectors. And these deals aren't just boardroom headlines. They can affect everything from your prescription and childcare costs to the quality of your healthcare. Depending on your industry, it can also change how secure you feel in your job.
Private equity is huge in preschools now, huge in nursing homes, dentists, veterinarians, even public utilities. So toll roads, ambulances, they will often be the management firm for like electrical utilities, water companies, things like that. Once you start looking, you start to notice private equity everywhere, but unless you're specifically looking for it, you would have no reason to know.
That's Megan Greenwald, author of Bad Company, Private Equity, and the Death of the American Dream. Greenwald says it's important to understand how private equity firms typically run. She uses the example of a kid's lemonade stand to simplify the process.
They're pooling together money from various kinds of investors and combining it with bank loans to acquire a company. So if I am acquiring your lemonade stand, I am not using my own money to do it. I am using 70 to 80% of the money I use to buy your lemonade stand will be borrowed. And the rub is, even though I, as the private equity executive, am the one making the decision to borrow that money, only you, as the owner of the lemonade stand, are legally responsible for paying that money back. So I can buy your lemonade stand, load you down with debt. All of a sudden, you have no money left to buy lemons and sugar. And I don't have to, if you start going bankrupt, I don't have to pay any of that money back at all.
At the end of the day, the goal of a private equity firm is to help a company, but it's also to make a profit by ultimately reselling the purchased entity for a higher cost. And this can be a gamble. If the firm fails to make a profit and the brand continues losing money, the original owners may not be able to pay back the loan, and the business is forced to shut its doors. In this case, workers are laid off, the company can't pay back the loan, and all assets are liquidated in order to try and partially pay back the bank. You might be wondering, how is it legal that a firm uses a loan to buy a company, but if things go south, they don't take on the debt, but make it so that the original owners are held liable?
It's legal because nobody has ever regulated it. There have been efforts to regulate this legally. Elizabeth Warren has proposed several times what she calls the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would take many steps against private equity, but one of the most fundamental would be requiring private equity firms to share in the responsibility for the debt they take out.
However, Greenwald says that 88% of congressional members on both sides of the aisle receive private equity donations through lobbying tactics. So there's not a lot of momentum in Washington, D.C. to regulate this industry. In addition, these firms also benefit from government tax breaks through certain loopholes. One such loophole is the role that private equity plays in managing millions of Americans' pension funds.
Pension funds are a huge source of capital for private equity firms, and public pension funds fund the retirement of doctors, teachers, nurses, public employees, usually on the state level. So the biggest public pension fund in the country is the California Public Employees Retirement System. And so private equity will say, yes, of course we benefit regular citizens because all of these teachers, nurses, firefighters are able to retire based on our money. That is true. I don't fully buy the argument that it has to be that way. I think one real problem with the private equity system is that logic turns capitalism into this sort of zero-sum game where, in order for this group of workers, the firefighters, teachers, nurses, to win, this other group of citizens has to lose out.
One company that lost out in this process was Toys R Us. The once profitable national toy store chain went bankrupt after it was bought by Bain Capital in 2005.
33,000 workers were laid off without the severance they were promised in their contracts. And yes, that did ultimately benefit the teachers and firefighters and nurses whose pension funds were invested because the private equity firms made money off of that Toys R Us deal, even though the company literally went under. That's how favorable the laws are to private equity. But I think we're in dangerous ground if we're arguing that the only way to allow these people to get their retirement is to essentially screw over those 33,000 Toys R Us workers.
While private equity has earned a reputation for malicious business practices, it's important to note that not all such deals end in failure or bankruptcy. Richard Coffin is a registered portfolio manager in Canada and is also the host of the popular YouTube series, The Plain Bagel. In his videos, he covers several topics from investing to personal finance. He says there are many players in this space, and to lump them all together isn't fair.
Hilton Hotels is one that's been highlighted before as a company that was more or less turned around with private equity. So there are circumstances where you've seen companies emerge out better for it as a result of private equity. That's not to say there's not attrition along the way. There are often layoffs. It tends to be one of the favorite tools of private equity companies is to first lay people off and try to save money that way. But if a company is facing sort of its demise and decline otherwise, there are circumstances where companies have been pulled out of that with private equity's involvement.
For example, in real estate, Coffin says there's a lot of misinformation as to just how much real estate, including single-family homes, private equity is buying up.
There are rumors that 40% of homes were bought by private equity in 2024, and that large companies like Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock are set to own 60% of U.S. homes by 2030. These are pretty ridiculous claims that really just aren't backed. Currently, the stats are that the industry as a whole, so investment companies, mega corporations, own less than 1% of current single-family residences. I believe the estimate last time I checked was around 0.3 or 0.4%. And that their buying activity, so again, this is mega corporations with 1,000 properties or more, accounts for 9% of investor activity, or on a total basis, 2.3% of total buying activity. So that's not nothing. 2.3% of the US market is still a sizable amount, but you can see it's not sort of the main demand driving factor. And there are other things that need to be considered.
Coffin does agree that private equity needs to be better regulated to limit the number of risky and unethical tactics, especially as these firms now hold a growing stake in American industries. Zooming out, Greenwald says that 8% of the U.S. workforce is currently employed by one of these firms. If you're curious, you can always Google and ask, is this hospital or corporation or apartment complex owned by private equity? And that question, who owns the companies we rely on, is one that more people may need to start asking, because in today's economy, ownership isn't just about profits. It's about power. Megan Greenwald's Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream is available now online and can be requested through your local bookstore. To find out more about our guests this week, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen and Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.